live right now. The hangout is on air right now. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks very much for having me here. I really appreciate it. As Ulysses had shared probably before, I have where I live, Cleveland, Ohio, for about the past 10 years, but most recently, and really like in a variety of ways. So as a early employee, I was employee number 1 at a startup company right out of business school back in 2005. And then after that, I started my own company after about 6 years there, and that company was eFuneral. And eFuneral is really the first time for me where, you know, we took the launch, or took the leap rather, and, you know, went through the whole process of raising seed capital from various places, whether it be angel investors, even venture capital. We took advantage of also some local resources that we had available to us. In fact, probably half of the $1 million that we raised was through different grants, loans, different types of opportunities that our state made available as they're trying to make sure they're doing a better job really making funds available to entrepreneurs. So that is the, you know, eFuneral is really the point in time for me where I became familiar with the process of raising seed capital, especially as a technology startup in particular. And what happened was after my time at eFuneral, which was about 3 years, I just was asked so many times, you know, in coffee meetings and just what have you, but, you know, hey, Mike, how did you do it? You know, you ended up raising close to $1 million. It's not an easy thing. So what was the process you went through? How, if you're starting from scratch and never done it before, how do you go about doing that? And I had to really think because it wasn't something like I knew exactly what we did, you know, that put us in the position to raise that money. But, you know, I got asked that question, so many started to really think more about that. And ultimately what happened is I decided to put everything that I learned into a book, and I ended up writing a book called Startup Seed Funding for the Rest of Us. And I launched that this past April. And the whole intention of the book is to really take what we learned, specifically raising that money outside of Silicon Valley. I feel like there's Silicon Valley and then there's everywhere else. And I visited Silicon Valley several times. We had, you know, investment conversations from different places within San Francisco and Palo Alto and all sorts of places around there. But it's different when you're in a place like, well, at least for me, Cleveland, or other friends that I had running businesses in, you know, Louisville, Kentucky, Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I'm sure where you're at, it's just quite different than what it's like in Silicon Valley. So what I did in this book was I took everything that I had learned, and then I talked to others. In fact, I ended up interviewing 7 other entrepreneurs that have raised capital outside of Silicon Valley. And then I talked to 7 investors that funded those very companies as well. And I learned so many different interesting things from them that, you know, I didn't even have the perspective of, you know, going just off of my own experiences. So what happened is I collated that all together and put it into a book, and the response has been awesome. I think mostly because it does resonate with a lot of entrepreneurs that, hey, things do work differently outside of a major tech hub like Silicon Valley or even New York, or, you know, there's maybe a couple of other places where you could say, hey, the market's very similar. You know, I know my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio is just very different. But what I thought I could do is, you know, go through and at least some of the higher level topics that I covered in the book, just sort of like learnings, if you will. I thought we could go through that together here. And then I wanted to leave just as much time as possible for questions and just understanding what's on your mind. You know, I was in your shoes a little bit. For eFuneral, we went through an accelerator ourselves. It was called the 10 Accelerator, and it was a part of the Global Accelerator Network as well. And then, you know, I've since then mentored at various accelerators as well. So, but, you know, the first thing I want to start with, which was just one of the big learnings that came out of the book, is, first of all, it's okay to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond. So for us in Cleveland, Ohio, we really developed a reputation for ourselves as, one of the, most talked about startup companies here in the area. Now, if we were in a place like San Francisco, what happens is we're competing for all sorts of things, talent, investment, but also attention. The attention is an important thing, because here in Cleveland, we actually, despite being, relatively smaller in the grand scheme of things as a startup, we were seen as sort of the next big startup that's coming out of the area, and people really went out of their way to help us. And whether that was for making introductions to other investors, whether it was making introductions to potential partners, that was a big deal. And I think in a place like Cleveland or anywhere else where you're at, you might find the same doors open. Whereas in a place like Silicon Valley, there's just so many people competing for the attention of others that it might be really hard to, to sort of get that sort of status with people. So that was an important thing for us. Another point that I'll make though is you have to really think beyond your own geography, and this is specific to raising the capital. Okay, so in Cleveland, it's true that we ended up raising a lot of money from our local area, and it makes sense, right? So investors, especially at the seed stage, they like to invest in what's around them, and a part of that is, they want to be able to, maybe pop by the office or meet you for coffee. One of the people I profiled in the book was Randy Komisar, and he's a partner at Kleiner Perkins, and they're one of the biggest venture capital firms really in the world, certainly one of the most well-known. And for Randy, he actually said, for him to invest in a startup, they do have to be in Silicon Valley, but that's only because he's in Silicon Valley. So, and he's talking especially at that seed stage. He wants to be able to work with people, hand in hand. And he feels like if somebody's not near him, for him personally, that's sort of a deal breaker. But I talked to so many other investors, Morris Wheeler, as an example. He's an angel investor, splits his time between Cleveland and Boulder, Colorado. David Cohen, he, speaking of accelerators, he's the founder and the CEO of Techstars, which operates all over the world now at this point. But they actually don't have any bid. And for Morris, location isn't as big of a deal, but even Morris spending time in Cleveland and Boulder, he'll say, well, I probably skew a little bit towards the local area because it's great to meet with folks, personally and see them face to face. But, I'm open to investing everywhere. And so I think that's really important to understand, because oftentimes I'll run into founders in a certain area where they'll say, hey, look, we've talked to all of the investors in my local area and, nobody's investing, or, hey, we got a couple people to invest, but we're pretty much tapped out. So, we're probably not going to be able to raise anymore. Now, the thing to think about is whether the people in your own backyard are actually the right type of investors for you. Now, I'll give you an example of just where I live, Cleveland, Ohio. Tech startups, that's actually not the bread and butter for a lot of investors or entrepreneurs here. And in fact, I say entrepreneurs too, because usually what happens is entrepreneurs will end up doing really well with their business. Maybe they'll sell the business, or, it ends up coming into profitability. And so they'll make a lot of money from that. Well, what do they do with that money? Oftentimes they become investors and they're putting it back in their local startup ecosystem. Well, sometimes what happens is they're investing in what they know. And so in a place like Cleveland, Ohio, what's really known around here is medical devices, a little bit in biotech. It's not internet businesses for the most part. There aren't many startups that have really gotten going in Cleveland in the internet space that have, had a big exit. There are some, but it's just not as many. So it could very well be that a business like eFuneral, even if we didn't find those investors in Cleveland, that's actually okay, because what's more important than finding the local investor is finding the right type of investor. And for us, I think it was important to sort of make a list of characteristics of what we were looking for in an investor, and then find people that match those characteristics, whether they're in your backyard or they're not. So that's something I usually share with teams. Usually then though, the first question is, well, okay, but I don't, I live in Cleveland, or I live, wherever it might be. I don't have a big network out of here. How am I supposed to really build my network up? And that's a legitimate question. I mean, we at eFuneral, me personally, I didn't have a big network outside of Cleveland when we were just getting started, but I ended up building it. And I actually built it without really visiting a whole lot of other places. I did visit some, but social media is one way that I ended up building relationships and building my network beyond my own geography. And I'll give you a couple of specific examples. Twitter, for instance, is, obviously it's a huge platform and it's a way that a lot of people connect with each other now. But what happened with us in particular is, I started really tracking the specific investors that I thought would be good fit for eFuneral. And many of them were in Cleveland. And so what did I do? Well, I started connecting with them on places like Twitter. And I didn't bombard them with pitches or anything like that. But what I did do was pay attention to the conversations they were having. And I would start to contribute in those conversations. Maybe they wrote a blog post, and so I would end up sharing it with my audience. Maybe they were asking their followers on Twitter a certain question. Well, I would respond with an answer to that question. And what happened is, over time, I actually ended up building relationships with people that I had never even met in person, that were in places like San Francisco, New York. And so when I would go to those places, now it wasn't a cold call email that I would send out trying to get a meeting with these folks. It was actually a quick message, and usually within minutes, I would confirm a meeting with them. And in fact, some of those people that I connected with way back then are still in my network today. So people like David Cohen, he was one of the people I profiled for the book. The whole first communication that we had was almost exclusively on Twitter. In fact, David, I'd sent out it's sort of a funny side story, but I had sent out a tweet that I had dreamt that I pitched David Cohen, and I wrote about that on Twitter. And in fact, the next day I dreamt that I had pitched Michael Arrington, who used to run TechCrunch. And so again, I tweeted, hey, 2 nights ago in a dream, I pitched David Cohen. Last night I pitched Michael Arrington. I'm productive even when I'm sleeping. Well, David Cohen wrote back on Twitter and said, what, my advice wasn't good enough? You had to go to Arrington? Just kind of joking about it. But that opened up the door for me, and I ended up reaching out and saying, hey, your feedback was great in my dream, but I'd love to get your feedback on my prototype in real life. Is there any way we could do that? And so that ended up spurring some email conversations, which later led to phone conversations. And actually, we were in due diligence with David to invest in eFuneral. And ultimately, he didn't, but he's now somebody in my network that even now today, if I have a specific question or need feedback or need a favor, like profiling him in the book, he's somebody that I can turn to. I guess one of the only other things that I want to point out from the book, just in terms of a major learning, and I just alluded to it, is the prototype. I mentioned I wanted to put my prototype in front of David. I will say it is important that you have to build something at this stage. So for seed stage companies that want to raise investment, and this might be specifically on the tech side, so take it for what it's worth, but investors don't really invest in ideas anymore. They invest in more than that. And usually they have to see something tangible, something in front of them before they're ready to invest. So oftentimes that's a prototype. It might be a working demo that somebody could actually use and play with. Or if it's a physical product, it might actually be just a very, unsophisticated but physical product that they can actually put in their hands and play with. The point being, it has to be much more than just an idea at the stage, at least at the seed stage, for investors usually to open up their pocketbooks and actually write checks. They want to know that you can actually take something and run with it, and actually not only have this be an idea, or you're not completely reliant on their money to take your idea and do something with it, but that you actually have the wherewithal within yourself to actually take it and run with it. So building a prototype. So let me go back and just make sure of these high level areas. I want to make sure I'm hitting on all of the ones from the book that I think are important. So we talked about being able to build something like we talked about thinking beyond, which I think is important. We talked about using networks like Twitter to build your network beyond just where you live. so that when you are thinking beyond your geography, you actually have a way to connect with these folks there. And I do think that that's really important as well. I think those are, for me, those are the top of mind sort of just major subjects that came out of the book that are really important. Obviously, I go into a lot more detail. But what I thought that we could do is let's open it up. And I figured let's have this be a conversation. So if there are questions, things that are on your mind, I don't know if anybody actually has read the book, but if you had questions specific from the book, that's great. We could dig into them too there. But maybe we could just go to some questions now, if that's okay.
Thanks, Mike. Well, in your book, you mentioned that traction is also very important, not only getting a prototype or a demo product. What is the best way, or in your case with eFuneral, how do you get to a very good traction? What were your strategies and how long did it take you to get to that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So it's absolutely true. The thing to keep in mind is traction's relative. And you can almost think of it as like a spectrum, as opposed to just saying like, oh, here's one point. This is the traction point. We need to get this. For eFuneral, in the beginning, we needed to prove that families were actually interested in using the internet to find information about end-of-life planning. We also needed to prove out that funeral homes were willing to use online tools to market themselves to families. So if we're just starting from scratch, we have absolutely no traction at all, right? But there's different things that we can do to start, making our way along that spectrum. So one of the things that we did was, and this is the case for a lot of startups. You could do this, but we got funeral homes to agree. Basically, we had a non-binding MOU, memorandum of understanding, and all it was is a non-binding document that they signed to say, yes, when this service is ready, I am pretty certain I'm going to sign up. Now, it wasn't really, legally, they could not sign up when we were ready. But what it did for us is it was our investors that even at the very earliest stage, before a single line of code is written, that our customer base actually did see this as a problem. They actually did see it as a pain point, and they were willing to pay for that. They were willing to become customers of ours. And there's some risk there for sure. But that was one way that we were able to show a little bit of traction in the very, very beginning. Investors would love to see traction such that, you're proving that the guess that you have for your startup becoming a business is actually true. But it's just not easy to do that right from the very beginning. You're trying to build your product, market it, get it out there all at once. So a lot of times getting customers to sort of, whether it's signing an MOU or if it's a consumer business, even having them pre-order the product, that's another great way. I mean, that's completely built around this model of proving early traction. If you think about it, there's a company that could put out, hey, we want to have $100,000 goal. And if we meet this goal, we're going to be able to build this product. Well, if they actually can get $100,000 worth of business, that's proving traction right there. So traction is super important, but just keep in mind that it's relative and something is better than nothing. So rather than think about, just the end game and what you have to do to get to the end game, think about what can I do now that might be able to show that a customer is going to be willing to pay for this, or what's the best way for me to maybe get a customer to pay for this right now before waiting until the very end where maybe the product will be fully ready.
Open the mic for other questions.
Yeah.
Hi, I don't know if you mentioned this in your presentation, but did you incorporate in Delaware or in Cleveland? And how did this help you with investment?
Yeah, I think, and I'll make sure I understood the question, just because it was hard to hear it a little bit, but I think the question was whether we incorporated in Delaware or elsewhere. Is that right? Cool. So we actually took part in an accelerator that the state of Ohio put on called the 10 Accelerator. And as a part of that accelerator, there was a requirement that we had to be an Ohio company. So we started as an Ohio limited liability company. And, we knew that if we were to raise venture funding, or certainly, that first round of say past the $1 million, we would probably have to convert to a C Corp. And oftentimes it is a Delaware corporation that people do either convert to or they start right from the beginning. But we actually started as an Ohio LLC. And I'll say for us, it never caused us any problem. So there's, lawyers will be better suited than me to talk about like the benefits, or even accountants, the benefits of an LLC versus a C Corp. But, there certainly are tax reasons why most companies do incorporate as a Delaware corporation. And I will say, if we had raised venture funding beyond what we did, we would have had to convert to do that. I mean, there are some investors that we talk to that, their standard term sheet is you have to be a Delaware C Corp. So I suppose, there's an argument that if you're going to do it at all, you could do it right from the very beginning. There are, at least for our case in Ohio, being able to operate as an LLC, it's a lot easier to do that. There are fewer restrictions. There's fewer requirements in terms of what's needed as a board. So our position was, well, let's just get started and let's see is there anything even here? Like, do we even have a business? And if so, then we can always convert later on. I could say though, there's definitely a case to be made that if you're thinking already that your business is going to be a scalable business, and that's the end, that it probably makes a lot of sense to just do that from the very beginning. The only thing I want to point out is just if you don't do that from the very beginning, it's not as if you're, doomed later on or anything like that.
How many people were there in your team, and how did you define the different roles, and how strong was your team in order to pitch to investors and they can buy not only the product or idea, but also the team?
Yeah, so initially our team was 2 people. It was me and my co-founder, Brian. And I'm not a technical person, so I'm more on the business end. I went to business school. I mostly had customer-facing roles at that first startup I worked for. So sales, marketing, business development. I ran our sales team. Brian was technical. So Brian was the first software engineer that our company hired. And, he and I became really good friends. So it's not only that we had, 2 people with business and then technical experience, but it was also that, we trusted each other big time. And there are a couple things I think are important to think about when it comes to the team. The first is just the type of company that you're running. If it's a tech company, for instance, investors will almost always expect that you have some level of technology team. It doesn't have to be within all of the members. And it's not an absolute. I mean, I actually know companies that, non-developers that ended up starting tech companies, and, even to this day, they don't have the technical expertise, but now people on their team do. And they were able to get started without any technical people on the team. I will say to a lot of investors, though, that's important. So Morris Wheeler, I mentioned him before. He's one of the people I profiled in the book. He has a kind of like a saying for it, and it's the hacker, the hipster, and the suit. And to him, it's important that any startup team that he invests in has all 3 of those roles in the team. The hacker being the technical person, they're the ones that have the development experience. The suit, as you might expect, is somebody with business chops, somebody that is well suited to think about what business model might be appropriate, that might be willing to go and sell to customers. That's what he envisions as the suit. The hipster is interesting. It's really somebody that has more design and product management skills than anything else. It's one thing to be able to build a product, but it's another thing to build a product that people care about and that people are willing to pay for. And that's where the product management side of it is really, really important. And so for Morris, a team has to have all 3 of those traits. It doesn't have to have 3 people. It could be 2 people that has all 3 of those traits. For Morris, it's almost never one person. So, usually it'd be rare to have one person that has all of those traits. But for me at eFuneral, we had, I would say we definitely had the hacker and the suit. And in a way, the hipster, I guess we both kind of played that hipster role a little bit too. But I think one thing that usually doesn't get talked much about. It's usually you have to have that technical experience. Well, it's not just that, but you have to have a really strong relationship too. One of the things that I realized is that running a startup, having a business partner for your startup, it's just like being married. It's just like having a husband, a wife, or a life partner. And you have to be able to trust that person with, like nothing else. Because the reality is you're going to be spending, if you are married or in a committed relationship, you're spending much more time usually with your business partner than you are with your life partner. And there just has to be that level of trust there. Brian and I had that. We were friends ahead of time. We knew each other really well. We knew how we could best work off of each other, but we also knew kind of what made each other tick. I sometimes get really scared when I hear of companies that will, or not necessarily, it could be events, whatever, where they match up co-founders. It's almost like, I've heard of these events where it's like co-founder speed dating. And that's fine if, it's fine as a way to network, but I would never recommend meeting somebody for the first time and saying, oh, great, you're a developer? Would you want to be a co-founder with me? I mean, it'd be akin to, meeting somebody at a bar and just asking them to marry you right on the spot. You just wouldn't do that. That doesn't make any sense. You don't know what it's like to live with that person, or you don't know what it's like to actually work with that person. So I would just say, no matter what you do in terms of finding another co-founder, and whether it's a technical company or not, just make sure you get to know that person really well and have a high level of trust before you actually bring them on the team.
Hi, Mike. How much money did you get from seed funding and later rounds, and where did you invest it? How did you spend it?
Yeah. So we raised close to $1 million all told, but it wasn't all at once. So for us, it was much more of a sort of a rolling close throughout the 3 years that we ran eFuneral for. And initially, I would say it did come at sort of a few major stages. So pre-product, meaning we didn't have any sort of product to show, just sort of basic prototypes. And I think we raised about $200,000, and that was mostly coming from angel investors. In particular, there was one venture capital fund that invested a very small amount. It was mostly so that they could have an option to be a part of our our Series A round if we were to ever get to that point. But that initial round was about $200,000. Once we got to the point where the product was actually out, we took advantage of a lot of local funding that didn't come from angel investors, but they came from, they're basically like really entrepreneurially friendly loans that, again, are available here in Northeast Ohio. So we had I'd say about $500,000 from those types of places as well. And then, we had actually before that point, we had another follow-up with current and new investors as well, angel investors. Now, so again, about $1 million, but just keep in mind, especially for companies outside of Silicon Valley, but even those that are in it, usually the stories you hear about of like, oh yeah, they closed, in 10 days and, then they got on with building their product. That's usually for the people that have either done that before, or they have some sort of reputation where, investors know them really well and and it's an attractive deal. So they're willing to do that. For I would probably guess the majority of startups, that's not the case. Usually you have to raise a little here and there. So for us, again, 3 years, $1 million, but it was over those 3 years. Now, in terms of what did we actually use it for? If you look back at our expenses over the course of time, the majority of it went to people. It was Brian and me, we did eventually pay ourselves, but it was a really small amount. It was an amount that was much less than what we were making at our previous jobs. But, we're both married. We both had young families. So, we had to. It's not as if we had personal finances where we couldn't pay ourselves anything. But we built a team, so we brought on 2 people full-time initially, and later on a third person, a full-time software developer. And, that's where a lot of the funding went. Another area where funding went is what I'll call, marketing experiments. I'll call them experiments because the reality is, for a startup, you have no idea what's going to work and what's not going to work in the beginning. So rather than having a set marketing budget and having this big plan, and you could plan it out, in January and in December, you stick to that plan. Like you've stuck to the plan the whole time. Rather than doing that, it's really like, what experiments can you carve out? And then, what's really measurable. So that was something that we did. We tested things like trade shows, tested things like search engine marketing. And so we had money set aside for experiments like this, but if they didn't work, we would move on from them and, really try to think of a completely different experiment. So that was, that was another piece for us. Luckily for us, rent was something we didn't have to spend a lot on. We got some really good deals in terms of being a part of essentially co-working space with another entrepreneur and another startup team. So it wasn't, the space wasn't co-working for everybody, but we basically split an office with another startup. So I think we paid about between $100 to $150 per person per month. So, it was less than $1,000. I do know if you're in a place like San Francisco, that might be one of your biggest costs. Luckily for us, and hopefully for you all, unless you decide you want to head to the Valley, that's not an expense that you'll have to live with as much. So I would say that's where those are probably. Now, that's the majority of where the expenses actually were for us.
Thank you, Mike.
Hi, Mike. This is David. I see you were acquired last year. And if it's possible, I would like to, if it's possible, you can share to us how was this process. I mean, the company reached you, or it was vice versa? And what are the steps in the an acquisition process, right?
Ulysses, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, he's saying that since you were acquired by another company, how was the process if the company approached you or you were the ones selling the company? How was it?
Yeah, got it. So I'll be straight up with you all, because if you do read the book, this is a spoiler alert, you'll learn this from the book. Yes, most of our assets were technically acquired, but it was not by any means a win of an acquisition. The reality is we failed. We failed at what we had set out and all, but we didn't, crash into a brick wall and burn bridges with people. We were able to find a few companies that were much bigger that did see some value. Homesteaders Life Company was a company that we had sold our assets to, and they were primarily interested in our brand and content that we had developed. So, we did build a brand in a very short period of time within the death care space anyway. And the content, we had hundreds of articles on funeral planning that just never existed. I mean, this was a topic that people didn't really like talking about. So we were kind of at the forefront of that. Now, in terms of how we found them, it was really two things. One is throughout the entire 3 years of eFuneral, I made it a point to continue to network within the industry and meet other people and, make sure that I was top of mind for other people. I spoke at industry events. I actually wrote for industry publications. We tried to get around the fact that eFuneral, we were complete unknowns. We didn't come from the industry. We tried to get around that by making ourselves pretty visible within the industry. Towards the very end, when we got to a point where we realized, hey, we don't think we're going to be able to raise more funding beyond what we took in, and our business model just isn't there yet. It's not, we're generating revenue, but it's not to the point where we're sustainable. What are our options? Well, one of the options was we could approach companies to acquire us. And so we were deliberate about that. We made a list of about 25 to 30 companies that we thought, we could add some sort of value to. And we reached out directly to their, CEOs. I mean, we had never done this before, but this was sort of the advice that we got. And we were really direct about it because at this point, we didn't have the time to sort of beat around the bush. There was a period of time before where we were, kind of acting like, well, we'd be open to that, but, we're still moving along the path. Well, at this point with Homesteaders, we knew that very quickly within a couple or a few months, we need to find an acquisition partner. So the thing is, the CEO at Homesteaders, he's one of the people that I had developed a relationship with over time, just as a part of being in the industry. So some of the people that we had reached out to, it was situations like that where there was already an established relationship. But some people, it wasn't. I mean, in some people, I just kind of cold reached out. And you'd be surprised that even in those situations, how quickly, you know, I'd get responses back from CEOs of companies that were $100 million plus that were interested in talking, you know, right away. And not all of them resulted in offers or anything, but we did end up having 2 offers for what we had built, and Homesteaders was the company that we ended up taking them up on. But yeah, you won't ever see, you know, a press release about that acquisition, because it just, you know, if I'm being really open and transparent with you all, it just wasn't the big win for us. But I mean, that doesn't take anything away from our experience at eFuneral, and I will say opportunities opened up for me personally and for my partner Brian after we went through that acquisition, because we did go, you know, I think we went about things the right way, you know, not burning bridges, really being open and honest with our employees and investors and all that.
All right. What are you doing right now? You have another company, right? You're working on another startup.
Yeah, so there's 2 things that are keeping me busy. Actually, there were 3 if you were to count the book. But I launched the book in April, and I haven't really done, you know, too much marketing. Really haven't spent much time after I had released the book. But it was nice getting to the point where I could release it. So the 2 things that keep me busy today is, one, I'm the president of a company called Movable, which we have a wrist-worn fitness activity tracker, and then an online dashboard that we work with companies and schools for them to run wellness challenges through our device. But then also our dashboard is compatible with Fitbit, Garmin, Jawbone. You know, you don't have to use our device. It just so happens that we have a device that's low cost that people could use. So I joined that company. Was started by 2 mentors of mine. And one of them was the CEO from the beginning and the founder. The other was the primary investor, and he's the chairman. They both founded that first startup that I ever worked for, and they were investors in my company, eFuneral. And this again goes along, you know, the notion of, hey, opportunities opened up for me afterwards. Blake Squires, who was the CEO, he had asked if I could come in and run product. And so I'd really been VP of product since October. And it was only very recently that Blake made a personal decision that he wanted to step back from the business. He works with a lot of other startups. He's taking a less active role in the day-to-day, but he's still on our board. So they had asked if I would step up and be president for that company. So that takes up a lot of time for sure. You know, it's a full-time effort. I also am the co-organizer of Industry, which is a conference that we're a month here in Cleveland, Ohio, and it's really for people that are building, launching, and scaling products. And so we're bringing in some of the best product management and design, you know, people really all throughout the country or even the world. And the cool thing about that is, you know, I mentioned before, I kind of have a penchant for startups that are outside of Silicon Valley. Well, we actually are seeing registered attendees coming in from San Francisco, New York, Austin, Texas, have them come to Cleveland for this conference. So that's the URL. If you ever want to check that out, it's indsum.com. So INDSUM for Industry Summit, and that's coming up in 3 weeks. So I have been getting up very early and staying up very late for the past few weeks, really, as things kick up for Industry. But yeah, those are the 2 things that mostly keep me busy right now.
Mike, we lost you when you're saying the URL.
Oh yeah, it's INDSUM. So INDSUM for Industry Summit.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, I think there are no more questions, and we don't want to take much of your time, Nelson. So we really appreciate your time, Mike, and it's very insightful, and I find very useful all your tips that you mentioned in your book, and probably I will encourage also the entrepreneurs to read it too.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And yeah, and if anybody has questions or things that they think of afterwards, Ulysses, you can put them in touch with me for sure.
Okay. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks. Thanks a lot, everybody. We'll see you later.
Bye-bye.